didn't have trouble attracting guys. Like, guys were always attracted to her for her beauty. She had a very unique look. A lot of people were definitely drawn to it.
She met my father in high school.
Obviously, her being just 16, there was a concern there of the age gap and maybe the influence that he had on the choices that she was making. I think my aunt and uncle were maybe torn because he presented himself very well, was very polite, and made very good conversation. And so I think in a way that impressed them.
My father had portrayed himself as he was like a little bit more stable, I guess, than other guys. He kind of portrayed like this kind of like bad boy vibe, and my mom was attracted to it.
I remember very distinctly the opportunity to meet him for the first time. She brought him to the house, and he pulled up in the front of the house in a really nice car. He got out very handsome, just a beautiful looking man, dressed really nice. I kind of came from a rural setting where the boys never dressed like that. And so I was like, oh, something I would have seen in a movie. She became very consumed with her relationship with him. And often when I would try to call, this is before cell phones, so if I tried to call the house, my aunt or uncle would say, oh, she's not here, she's with Tom. I just remember very distinctly her infatuation with him.
Everyone thought the world of him. They thought he was so charming and so kind and so sweet. And I know my grandmother thought he was a good person. She thought he was a good man and thought that he treated my mother well. And at some point, he convinced her to run away with him.
They made the decision together to move to California. She didn't share a lot of details other than she was very excited about it.
I think he promised her a life and a family. My mother, she always wanted kids. She loved children. And I think he promised her this beautiful life together, that they could run away and build this wonderful dream together. They could have this life, have this family, and everything would be perfect.
There was a little bit of a ripple effect of shock because none of us knew. I remember that I felt very betrayed and I felt very hurt. And I remember going, what just happened? Like, how did this girl that was a very much an active part of our life, I would consider her one of my best friends. How did we go from that and these weekly conversations and this time well spent to not even knowing about her wedding, not even being invited to her wedding? I was very saddened that she had chose to run away and leave the family and leave school and leave her sports and leave us.
The hard truth is that they struggled in California. Unfortunately, it didn't work out the way he had sold it to my mother.
They had some problems in California. My father, he had gotten in trouble with an apartment complex. From what my grandmother tells me, my father would poke holes into walls and he would peep. He would watch people. But he was doing things that he shouldn't, and none of us really understood what that meant. It just appeared as though they were running away from whatever it was he got himself into. They came back to Colorado and they bought the house that me and my brother grew up in. I wish I could ask my mother what she thought or felt, but maybe she thought that if we have a baby, it'll change. Maybe everything will be okay. She found out she was pregnant with me, and I think she began looking for more support from her own family.
When Cheryl became pregnant with Shelby, a spark came back to her, and she was very excited about the prospects of being a mom. And then, of course, when Shelby arrived, then a few years later, Sean comes, and she was just so full of love and joy.
Having two children and having this family, I think it began to shift her focus, and I think that's when things started to change.
My mom's world stopped revolving around him, and that it started revolving around us, and that she was prioritizing us over prioritizing him. He liked to be the center of attention. He's just kind of like a narcissist that way, and only ever thought about himself. Coming back to Denver was kind of the beginning of the end. They just started experiencing a lot more problems, and my dad started to become more aggressive. He would yell, he would throw things, he would break things. And it scared her, it scared us.
I have a lot of memories from being a child and living in that house with my mother and my father. You know, I remember him reading me books, but I also remember him screaming and throwing things. And I remember my mother crying, and I remember just being terrified.
I began to notice a change in Cheryl. Something was just a little off. Her luster for life was very much diminished. It just seemed, when you were around them, it seemed very tumultuous and a lot of anxiety and nervousness.
There were times where he would start shouting, and him and my mother, they would argue in their bedroom. And I could see through the door, the crack in the door, I could see him yelling and screaming at her, and I'd see him hit her. I think she began to realize that maybe my father was not the man that she thought he was. He was not the person that she thought he was, and I think she knew that he was a danger to me and my brother. My father, he was charming and he was very charismatic. He was intelligent, he was good looking, he was easy to talk to, he was normal. But he was also terrifying to anyone that knew him. For my father, it was always about power and control. That's all it was ever about. He told me if I spoke or if I told anyone or talked about anything, he would hurt them.
I remember him making comments about Cheryl's looks, negative comments about her looks, and negative comments about her being a mother. I remember being pretty angry at the way he was treating her. She was always on alert, and she was always very concerned about what he was going to do to her or to her kids.
They were pretty broke. He struggled to maintain a job. He was just stuck, and he was stuck not being the priority. He was stuck having no power, no control, and of us coming first. When the emotional abuse, the yelling, breaking things wasn't effective anymore, he escalated in his behavior, get more physical.
I watched him hurt my mother. I watched him beat her, and he would scream at her. He would throw beer bottles.
When he started getting physical, she would have a bunch of bruises on her. And that sounded the alarm for a lot of people, and thought the best way to go was just to call law enforcement and have them deal with it.
When somebody calls to report a crime of domestic violence, they're obviously looking for help. In Cheryl's case, making the call to the Thornton Police Department at least initiated the start of a police response, the start of victim services, and the start of her journey through the court system. Kim was a victim's advocate, and they're a part of the detective division. They're a resource for the family, the victim's family, or the victim.
The first time I met Cheryl, she had reported to the Thornton Police Department that Tom had assaulted her. She would describe how he would grab her when she would try to leave the room. He would hit her. There was sexual abuse where it was like male privilege that she was going to have sex with him. And that was an experience that I believe that she had often. I think the scariest piece for Cheryl was her two children, Sean and Shelby. She was very fearful of Tom and his reactions.
He would get very angry. He would threaten to hurt us, or he would threaten to hurt my mother. Fear was what he used. He knew how to make people afraid.
Tom's abuse continued to get worse and worse. The more she stepped away and set those boundaries, the more aggressive, he got. She began to see the need to protect the kids even more.
I remember him throwing things against the wall, and I remember just being terrified. My mother was a very strong woman. Very, very strong. She was strong for me and my brother. And she always kept it together. She did her best to shield us from what was happening.
When she saw that Tom wasn't treating us right, I think it broke her heart. She was okay with him treating her like crap, but she wasn't okay with him treating her children like crap. And I think that was a huge push to leave him.
My mother reached out to the police department many times. She filed restraining orders, protective orders. Kim was helping my mother through all of these issues with my father.
She got a protection order as she gained more courage and was leaving the relationship.
She realized that, if she stayed with him, that she was going to end up dead, that we were going to end up dead.
I remember the day that we left, there were 2 suitcases in my closet, one for me, one for my brother. Well, my father, he told me to go get him a beer. I gave him the beer. And my mother, she told me to grab my brother, grab my suitcase, and get in the car. And that's exactly what I did. And as we're driving, pulling out of the driveway, my father comes out in a towel and he is screaming and yelling, and he throws the beer bottle. She was brave and she was strong, and it took so much courage for her to make that decision to leave, because leaving those relationships is dangerous and it can kill you.
I appreciate Cheryl's bravery so much. If someone is living in that situation with a manipulative, narcissistic, abusive person, by all means, get out.
I think one of the really positive things about Cheryl leaving the relationship was it really empowered her to be able to make her own decisions. As Cheryl began to leave that relationship, he was financially taking things away from her, not giving her, money to buy food, to buy clothes. Domestic violence is all about power and control and manipulation. She had to work more because he was not providing her the money that he said he was. He wasn't paying the bills. He wasn't doing the things that he needed to do.
My mother worked as a waitress. She worked a lot of hours. And my grandparents would help with me and my brother.
A lot of the time she was working 2 or 3 jobs just so we'd have a roof over our head and we'd have food and heat, and she would drop the world for us, and she would always put us first. She would do whatever she had to.
Because he still had visitation rights, she could potentially be harmed or could potentially have to deal with his anger and his wrath.
I do know that she felt very empowered that she was able to get out, but I also think that that was the moment that it was real. She knew at that point that things were going to get worse.
You're standing there in the doorway of the home I bought with my back and my credit, you thieving light.
Cheryl cared for those children deeply, and she worried about them, and she worried about leaving them with him.
We never wanted to leave our mom's house. We never wanted to go over and go see our father because we were afraid of him.
So the weekends we would spend over at his house. There was one time where I got very upset. I got in a fight with my brother, and it was your typical sibling bickering. But my father, he had a very short temper. He shoved me into the linen closet in his bedroom. He locked the door. I don't know how long I was in there, but it was dark when I went in. It was light when I came out. I know I had peed myself at least once. He would come by, he'd knock on the door, he'd yell. It was dark. I didn't know when I was getting out. I didn't know why I was in there. I didn't know what was happening.
It's always scary when he lost control. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed causing people pain.
Me and my brother both had parakeets. One blue, one yellow. Mine got sick, and I spent all day trying to nurse it back to health. I remember at the end of the day, I told him, "Dad, my bird's still sick. My bird is still sick. What do I do?" He grabbed my bird, and he squeezed it so hard the eyes popped out of its head.
And it wasn't enough for him to kill the bird in front of us. He made my sister cook the bird, and I had to eat it. And he thought it was funny. Like whatever part of him he was missing, he felt complete by terrorizing us.
He was a monster. He had evil intent at every turn. I think his behavior just continued to escalate. Tom was not only manipulative, but he would watch her.
He would stand outside of that restraining order limit, and he would stand there and watch her just to let her know that he was watching her.
Cheryl, this is Tom. Don't ever presume to tell me where I'm supposed to be. There is no 100 yards. I'm on a public street, on a public sidewalk. You don't tell me what to do.
Some of the messages that I heard were just completely bone-chilling to me.
You don't tell me where to be. The next time you lie to the cops, like you have before, you're going to suffer the consequences.
My father, he was losing sense of control over my mother because she began building a life for herself. She cut ties from her abuser. She filed for divorce, and she became independent. So they were divorced, and he had a girlfriend. He was seeing Sue Beamer.
It was troubling. The first time I ever saw Sue, there was like some sort of resemblance to Cheryl in their stature. It was like replacing Cheryl in the relationship that he was in. So I definitely do not think that Tom was moving on. Tom manipulated Sue. I think Tom truly manipulated everyone that he ever came in contact with.
My mother didn't do a whole lot of dating. She took care of us. That was her world until she met Ross.
With Cheryl, everything was on the table. The first day we were together, she told me that she had 2 kids, and that was certainly the center of her life. She also told me she had a psycho stalker husband, and if I was going to run, I should run now. She was fun. She was very outgoing. She was a joy to be with, and it wasn't just me who noticed that. Everyone noticed what a joy Cheryl was.
Ross and my mother, they fell in love. He treated her so well. He was good to her.
The very first time I met her, I gave her a key to my place. This was before we were even dating. I just said, "You're someone who needs a safe place to go. Here's a key to my place. Use it whenever you want."
She was getting her life together. She was working 2 jobs. She was going to school to be an accountant. She was fixing the house so her and Ross could move and start a new life.
Our lives became intertwined to the point where life without her was something that was no longer something I could imagine. We planned our future together because our present was together, and our present was so wonderful.
Tom became aware that she was about to move on without him, and she was going to take me and my brother with her. We were about to have a completely different life separate of him, and he couldn't stand it.
Tom's abuse continued to get worse and worse the stronger that Cheryl got. The more she stepped away and set those boundaries, the more aggressive he got. Once the perpetrator starts seeing that victim get stronger and stronger, the crazier and the more volatile that person becomes.
My guess is that this was kind of the tipping point for him. You know, knowing that she was with somebody who probably loved and adored her and treated her the way she deserved to be treated, probably just threw him into a downward spiral of evil.
He made blueberry pancakes and scrambled eggs. About an hour later, my head was foggy. Everything was spinning. At the time, I had no idea what was happening to me or why. So Tom gets on the phone, he calls my mother and convinces her that she needs to come pick me up because I'm sick. I'm crying, and he puts me on the phone with my mother, and I'm begging her to come get me. So we get off the phone, and Tom takes me and my brother, and we go in the car and we go for a drive. We ended up in a bar, and Tom got a phone call, and it was Sue. Tom got very angry. He was throwing his hands, he was yelling, he was angry, and he said, "I have to go do something, I'll be back."
They had been exchanging the children at the police station, but hearing her daughter crying and saying she was sick, she let her guard down and actually went to Tom's to get Shelby.
I know one of the things that Cheryl and I talked about was that she should never, ever go to his house.
She was fearful of Tom, and so obviously the child exchanges taking place at the police department was basically for her safety.
She got the call about Shelby being sick, and then Cheryl went over there. Cheryl went up to the apartment. When she was let into the apartment, Sue was there. Sue kind of looked like, maybe you really shouldn't be here.
911.
There's shooting over here.
Where's the guy that shot her at?
It was me.
It was you that shot her?
Yes, because she attacked me. There's shooting over here.
Where at?
In our apartment.
Who's been shot?
I think it was my boyfriend's ex-wife.
The 911 call comes into the Thornton Police Department, and that initiated the patrol response.
My boyfriend's ex-wife came in here and started yelling at me and screaming and grabbed the knife.
Why did you shoot her?
She came at me with a knife.
Susan, she made the 911 call. She was still on the phone with the dispatcher when the officers arrived. Other officers went into the apartment, found Cheryl's body, tried to administer life support with the assistance of paramedics, but she was obviously deceased. All we knew was that she had multiple gunshot wounds. We find multiple shell casings. Our CSI investigator was able to determine that Cheryl is running through the hallway where she shot twice in the back, and then she receives 2 more gunshot wounds, one to her upper chest and one to her thigh, and then there's a final gunshot wound which is in her head. The pathologist would tell us that the gunshot wound to the head could not have occurred as the first first wound. Tom arrived at the scene with Sean and Shelby around 9 p.m.-ish. When Tom shows up, there's still a large police presence, police outside his door.
I had never seen so many red and blue lights in my life. There was a fire truck, there was an ambulance, there were cops everywhere. And we got stopped by an officer, and he explained that my mother was shot and Susan was in the apartment.
Tom never asked what was going on. When he was asked, what does he know about what's going on, he refused to answer any questions.
Tom showed absolutely no concern. None. There was no expression, no concern for who had been shot, why, if Susan was okay, if my mother was okay. There was no concern for anyone. Me and my brother were taken to the police station. The officers, they tried to make us comfortable. They gave us water and crayons and a notepad. I drew pictures on that notepad that I still have to this day. I wrote that I missed my mother. I think I knew what had happened, I just couldn't comprehend it.
It was difficult to contemplate or realize what had happened. You don't really understand life and death as a child.
I went into the police department, got briefed about what had happened, and then I'd realized that Shelby and Sean were there.
Kim told us that my mother was dead. Overnight, my entire life had been turned upside down.
My whole world kind of crashed in. It's a call that no one ever wants to hear. It was a shock. It knocked me down.
I felt like I saw Shelby kind of suddenly take on like a new role with her brother.
It was almost like she had to take on the role of Cheryl and be a protector.
I believe it was about midnight before I interviewed Susan. Susan stated that Cheryl came over, said that I wasn't the mother of the children and I'll never be the mother. She pulled out a knife, and so I shot her. We obviously had a homicide. We had somebody who was confessing to it, and we had some physical evidence that showed that that person committed it. So that night, Susan Beamer was arrested and transported to jail on murder charges. I think there was always the sense that there was some involvement with Tom. It was just a matter of how much or, what role. We did talk to a neighbor. She saw Tom driving away in a hurry around 6 o'clock out of the apartment complex. Tom shows up at the police department and walks into the lobby. He said that I'm here for a child custody exchange. I want proof that I was here at the police department from 6 p.m. to 6:30. And the desk officer saw him arrive. I want to say it was around 6:20, 6:25. And so the officer would only write the time that he saw Tom there. He wrote on the card 6:30. So we thought Tom was trying to account for more time at the police department than he was actually there. What we knew about Tom certainly made him a person of interest. So Tom was brought in to the police department. That night, we did photographs of him. Tom didn't make any statements at the apartment. Tom didn't make any statements at the police department. So we certainly didn't have enough probable cause or any probable cause at that point to believe that he had any involvement in this. I don't think anyone was happy about letting Tom leave with no charges that evening, but legally, we had no choice.
I missed my mother. I couldn't understand that she was dead. I didn't talk about it. I didn't say anything until one day I did.
August of '98 is when Shelby provided her interview. saying that she heard Tom and Susan talk, changed the investigation.
She was blown away. I mean, she just could not believe the words coming out of my mouth.
Well, I heard my dad get up, so I went out to investigate.
Okay.
And I heard my daddy say, "Here, take this gun."
The night before she died, I was at Tom's apartment. And me and my brother, we were both sleeping. I remember Tom got out of bed.
Well, I heard my dad get up, so I went out to investigate.
Okay.
He had a gun in his hand. There was a little back and forth between the two of them.
And I heard my daddy say, "Here, take this gun and kill Cheryl."
Sue took the gun, and he told her he wanted to kill my mother, and the way he explained it to her is that they could get my mother out of the way and they could be together.
It was me.
It was you that shot her?
Yes, because she attacked me.
Why did you shoot her?
She came at me with a knife.
The information we had from the 911 call and what the officers observed in the apartment didn't really match up. Susan didn't have any injuries, so self-defense obviously became questionable.
Of course, I thought it was Tom. They said it was actually Tom's girlfriend, which never made any sense to me.
By December of '98, Susan had now been in jail 4 to 5 months. With the permission and cooperation of her attorney, she wished to provide a statement. Her first statement is that there was no plan, but it was actually Tom who shot Cheryl. And right after Tom had shot and murdered Cheryl, hands her the gun and says, "Claim you did it, and if you don't, I'll kill your kids." I mean, she went from, "I did it in self-defense, Tom wasn't even here," to now, "Well, Tom did it, but I had no idea this was gonna happen." That makes a little more sense, but it still doesn't make a lot of sense. Susan made her second statement. She finally came clean. Her part in this was that she was to keep Cheryl in the apartment until Tom got there.
He took the clothes off that he had, and the kids were actually down in the car, just sitting in the car waiting for their dad to come back.
When Tom came in, he was wearing a different shirt. He had black gloves on. And that's when Cheryl saw Tom and began to run down the hallway. And then the next thing Susan says is that she hears gunshots, Cheryl landing in the back room, and then more series of gunshots, which matches up with where the shell casings were found, at least. That makes more sense. She was then willing to testify against Tom.
As far as Susan Beamer goes, she made the plan with my father to kill my mother. They made the plan to take my mother's life.
August of '98, complete unrelated allegation against Tom had been reported to the Thornton Police Department, not for the homicide, but for a sexual assault on a child. It was fortunate for us that he was arrested and incarcerated, so we knew where to find him. We served the arrest warrant while he was incarcerated. With most jury trials, it's very tense. I would say this was a little more than most. It was just, you could just feel the tension during each day of trial.
We certainly hoped there would be some justice. You know, the person responsible would be held accountable,
The prosecutor lays out the case in a pretty chronological order. Susan does testify against Tom.
I remember the day that Shelby testified in court. She was such a little trooper. And to have to sit there and talk about that day, the day that her mom died, in front of her dad, who was, just a short distance away, she was just so brave.
I remember being on the stand, and his lawyer approached me. His lawyer began by saying, "Can you tell me the difference between the truth and a lie?" And I told him one was real, the other was not. And I remember looking at my father in that orange jumpsuit.
I think as we began to get into the trial and really kind of unpack all of the years of abuse, I think it really shined a light that Cheryl was an incredibly strong person.
I do recall some phone messages that Cheryl had received, some kind of veiled threats. We knew who he was threatening and what he was threatening.
You and your boyfriend, your dad and your brother are cowards. I'm a man. I can tear them apart.
When the guilty verdict was announced, the judge gave immediate sentencing.
I was very relieved. I was very happy that finally this man who deserved no freedom, that he was put away for life.
I remember as we were walking out of the courtroom, Tom jumped up and he started yelling at Shelby.
What he actually said was, "I love you." And he was trying to convince me that he didn't do it and that it was all a lie. I remember having nightmares about that as a child. Just the look in his eyes and the anger. His hands were clenched. It took 4 officers to hold him back.
This isn't just a bad person. This is an evil person. It's a level of evil that, I would hope most people never see in their lifetime.
I think if you define evil, I would say Tom Rogers fits that definition.
I think Tom being convicted obviously was a win, but it was just one chapter in a lifetime of healing for those children.
He was not free to hurt anyone. He was not free to do as he pleased. I did find solace in it, and I, to this day, believe that he's exactly where he belongs.
I look back now and think about the time I was with her as being a gift. I wish I'd had more time, but I am thankful for the time I did have.
I put together a scrapbook with a bunch of pictures of my mother and me and my brother, and we still have that book to this day.
She would give everything for her family. I thank her every day, and I love her, and I always remember her with a smile on her face.
I remember her as being a strong, independent woman. I remember her as being a brave woman. And she taught me how to be brave. She never stopped fighting, and that's how I want to remember her. She was my hero.
The wind didn't just blow through Summit County, Ohio, on the night of November 14th, 2010, it screamed. It was a low, hollow wail that rattled the aluminum siding of the houses on Elm Street, a sound that would later be described by neighbors not as weather, but as a warning. The mercury had plunged hours ago, freezing the last of the autumn rain into a treacherous, glass-like sheet over the asphalt, turning the quiet suburban sprawl of Akron's outskirts into a suspended, frozen tableau. It was the kind of cold that kept people inside, curtains drawn, televisions glowing blue against the darkness, insulating them from the world outside. But inside number 4202, the insulation had failed. Something had shattered the domestic quiet, something far colder than the Ohio winter. At 11:42 p.m., the 911 dispatch center in Akron received a call that would haunt the operator for a decade. It wasn't the volume of the voice on the other end that chilled her. It was the terrifying, rhythmic hyperventilation, a sound of panic so raw it felt wet against the ear. The man identified himself as Arthur Vance. He was gasping, choking on his own words, repeating a single phrase over and over, like a broken prayer.
She's gone.
The window is open. She's gone. Dispatchers are trained to cut through the hysteria, to anchor the caller in reality, but Arthur Vance was adrift in a sea of terror. He claimed he had just come home from a late shift at the auto plant. He claimed he had walked into his 14-year-old daughter's bedroom to check on her, a routine he had performed 1,000 times. But this time, the bed was empty. The duvet was pulled back, exposing the pale floral sheets to the frigid air. And the window, the second-story window that looked out over the black expanse of the backyard woods, was wide open. The screen had been slashed. Police units were rolling within 90 seconds. The first cruiser, driven by Officer Mark Halloway, skidded slightly on the black ice as it turned onto Elm Street. The silence of the neighborhood was absolute, broken only by the flashing interplay of red and blue lights bouncing off the frosted lawns. Halloway would later testify that the house looked like a tomb. There were no lights on downstairs. Only a single lamp burned in an upstairs window, casting a long, jagged shadow across the front yard. When Halloway stepped out of his vehicle, the air smelled of wood smoke and impending snow, a sensory memory that would trigger nausea in him for years to come. He didn't have to knock. The front door was unlocked, standing slightly ajar, swinging gently in the draft. Halloway pushed it open, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. "Police," he shouted. His voice died in the heavy, stifling heat of the hallway. The thermostat had been cranked up, warring with the freezing draft rushing down the stairs. Mr. Vance. Arthur Vance was sitting at the bottom of the staircase. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, the kind of man built for heavy lifting and silent endurance, but in that moment, he looked small, collapsed in on himself. He was wearing his work uniform, a grease-stained blue shirt with art stitched over the pocket. His hands were buried in his hair, gripping the roots as if trying to hold his head together. When he looked up, his eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a manic, terrified exhaustion.
He didn't speak.
He just pointed a trembling finger up the stairs. Halloway ascended. The house was immaculate. Family photos lined the wall. Arthur, his wife who had passed 3 years prior, and the daughter, Emily. Emily Vance. 14 years old. Bright blue eyes, braces, a smile that looked shy even in photographs. The pictures painted a portrait of a tight-knit, grief-bonded pair, a father and daughter against the world. But as Halloway reached the landing, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder. The door to the bedroom at the end of the hall was open. Inside, the room was a chaotic violation of sanctity. The pink walls, covered in banned posters and sketches, seemed to vibrate with the recent disturbance. The bed was indeed empty, the sheets cold to the touch. But it was the window that drew Halloway's eye. The sash was raised all the way up. The screen had been cut from the outside. A jagged, triangular flap of mesh flapped uselessly in the wind. Snowflakes were drifting in, settling on the carpet, tiny white intruders in a crime scene. Halloway moved to the window and looked out. It was a 20-foot drop to the frozen hydrangeas below. There was no ladder. No trellis. The siding was smooth vinyl. How could someone get up here? Or more disturbingly, how could a 14-year-old girl get down? He shone his flashlight into the yard. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the pristine, frost-covered grass. And there, stark against the white frost, were footprints. Not leading away from the house, but standing static, right beneath the window. 2 distinct sets. One large, heavy boot prints. The other small, bare feet. They stopped there. They didn't lead into the woods. They didn't lead to the driveway. They just existed in that one spot, a frozen stamp of a moment in time, and then nothing, as if they had vanished into the air. By midnight, the house was swarming. Detectives, forensics, K-9 units. The street was cordoned off with yellow tape that whipped violently in the wind. Neighbors stood on their porches, wrapped in bathrobes, arms crossed tight, whispering into the gale. The word spread like a contagion. Emily is missing. Snapped from her bed. Detective Sarah Miller took charge of the scene. She was a veteran of the force, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and had the hardened eyes to prove it. But something about Arthur Vance unsettled her immediately. It wasn't what he said. It was the oscillation of his emotions. One moment, he was catatonic, staring at the wall, unresponsive. The next, he was raging, screaming at the officers to do something, throwing a coffee mug against the kitchen cabinets, his face turning a deep, Venus purple. "Tell me about the last time you saw her, Art," Miller asked, her voice calm, measured, trying to lower the temperature in the kitchen. Arthur was pacing, his heavy work boots thudding against the linoleum. "I told you. I told the uniform. I left for shift at 3. She was doing homework at the table. Right there." He pointed a shaking finger at the oak table, where a geometry textbook still lay open, a pencil resting in the crease. I kissed her forehead. I said, "Lock the doors, Em." She said, "I know, Dad." That was it. That was the last time. "And you called her? During your break?" "Twice," Arthur snapped. 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. She didn't pick up the second time. I thought she was asleep. I thought she was safe. He slammed his fist onto the counter, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "Why didn't I come home? I should have come home." Miller watched him. The grief seemed performative, too loud, too kinetic. But grief is a strange beast. It manifests in ugly, unpredictable ways. She couldn't pin suspicion on a father just because he was loud. But she couldn't ignore the intuition pricking at the back of her neck, either. The forensics team was upstairs, dusting for prints. They found plenty of Emily's, plenty of Arthur's. But on the windowsill, the outer ledge, they found a partial smudge. A glove print. Leather. Textured. It was the first physical proof of an intruder. It validated Arthur's story. It suggested a predator, someone who had watched, waited for the father to leave, and scaled the wall with impossible agility. But as the night wore on, the timeline began to warp. The K-9 unit, a bloodhound named Buster, picked up a scent at the base of the window. The dog circled the footprints, whined, and then sat down. He didn't run toward the woods. He didn't run toward the street. He tracked the scent back toward the house, back toward the back door. Miller frowned as the handler reported this. "The dog is confused," the handler said, shrugging. "The frost messes with the scent molecules.
Or
the trail ends because they got into a car right here." "But there are no tire tracks on the lawn," Miller pointed out. "The driveway is on the other side. If they carried her to a car, they would have had to walk around. Maybe they carried her through the house?" Miller looked at the back door. It was locked, deadbolt from the inside. She walked over to it, examining the lock. No scratches. No forced entry. If the abductor had come in through the window and left through the door would be unlocked. If they went back out the window, carrying a struggling teenager, the drop would have broken legs. The physics of the crime were wrong. The geometry didn't add up. Miller went back to Arthur. He was sitting at the table now, staring at the geometry book. "Art," she said softly. "Did Emily have any problems? Anyone at school? A boyfriend you didn't approve of?" Arthur's head snapped up.
no.
No boys. She was 14. She was a baby. 14 isn't a baby, Art. Kids have secrets. "Not Emily," he insisted, his eyes narrowing. "We didn't have secrets. It was just us. After her mom died, we were everything to each other. She wouldn't run away. Someone took her. You have to find them." The desperation in his voice was compelling. It pulled at the heartstrings of the officers in the room. A widower, a blue-collar worker, a man who had lost everything in the span of an evening. The narrative was being written in real time. the tragic father, the victim. But outside, the search was expanding. Flashlights bobbed in the woods behind the house like fireflies in a graveyard. Volunteers were already gathering, despite the hour, despite the freezing cold. They called her name. Emily. Emily. The sound drifted through the bare trees, a mournful chorus. At 3 a.m., a discovery was made. Not in the woods, but in the garage. Officer Holloway had been tasked with checking the perimeter. He lifted the heavy garage door, shining his light into the cluttered space. Tools hung on pegboards, organized with obsessive precision. A sedan sat parked in the center. Holloway walked around the car. The hood was cold, but as he swept his light over the workbench in the corner, something glinted. It was a shovel. There was nothing inherently suspicious about a shovel in a garage. But this shovel was leaning against the wall, separate from the other garden tools. And on the blade, caught in the jagged edge of the metal, was a clump of soil. Fresh, wet, dark soil. Holloway touched it. It smeared on his glove. The ground outside was frozen solid, hard as concrete. To get wet, malleable earth like this, you had to dig deep. You had to dig below the frost line. He called Miller. When she saw the shovel, the air in the garage seemed to drop another 10 degrees. She looked at the soil, then back at the door leading into the house. "Bag it," she whispered, "and get a warrant for the car." They went back inside to confront Arthur. But the dynamic had changed. He wasn't the grieving father anymore. He was a variable in an equation that was rapidly resolving toward a dark conclusion. "Art," Miller said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "When was the last time you used the shovel in the garage?" Arthur blinked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. The hysteria paused, replaced by a flicker of something sharp, calculating. "The shovel? I don't know. Gardening. Weeks ago. Before the freeze. There's fresh dirt on it, Art. Wet dirt." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The hum of the refrigerator seemed deafening. Arthur stared at her, his jaw working. I buried a bird," he stammered. "A cardinal. Found it dead on the porch yesterday." Emily cried. She wanted it buried properly. "I had to dig deep to get through the frost." It was a plausible lie. It was quick. It was emotional. It used his daughter's empathy as a shield. Miller didn't buy it, but she couldn't disprove it. Not yet. "Show me," she said. "What?" "Show me where you buried the bird." Arthur stood up. He looked tired, so incredibly tired. In the flower bed, under the rhododendrons. He led them out into the biting wind. He pointed to a disturbed patch of earth near the porch. Sure enough, the mulch had been moved. Miller knelt, digging with her gloved hands. The soil was loose. She dug down 6 inches. There, wrapped in a paper towel, was a dead cardinal. Miller stared at the small red bundle. She looked up at Arthur. He was watching her, his face a mask of sorrow and defiance. "I told you," he said. "I would never hurt her. She's my life." For a moment, Miller felt a wave of doubt. Had she misjudged him? Was she so jaded that she saw monsters where there were only broken men? The glove print on the window. The footprints. The dead bird. It all fit his story. But as she stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, she noticed something else. Arthur was shivering. Not from the cold. He was a big man, used to Ohio winters, but from adrenaline. His pupils were blown wide. He was terrified. But was he terrified for his daughter, or for himself? The seed of suspicion had been planted, and no amount of frozen soil could kill it. The investigation into the disappearance of Emily Vance had officially begun, but the shadow of the father loomed large over the crib of the investigation. The police didn't know it yet, but they were staring at a puzzle where the pieces had been sanded down to fit, a picture curated by a master manipulator. And in the distance, the wind howled again, carrying the snow that would soon cover everything, the footprints, the disturbed earth, and the secrets of 4202 Elm Street. The storm was coming, and it would bury the truth for 14 long years. This was just the first night, the first layer of ice. The cold case had begun. By the 48-hour mark, The search for Emily Vance had transformed from a frantic neighborhood sweep into a massive, multi-agency operation. The Ohio State authorities had issued an Amber Alert that flashed across every digital billboard from Cleveland to Cincinnati, the grainy photo of Emily's smiling face contrasting sharply with the bleak, gray winter sky. But inside the command center, the optimism was curdling. There was no ransom note, no sightings of a suspicious vehicle, no digital trail on her laptop or cell phone. It was as if Emily had been plucked from existence by a ghost. Detective Miller stood in the center of the Vance living room, watching Arthur. He was surrounded by members of his church, men in heavy coats who patted his shoulders and offered hushed prayers. He played the part of the grieving father with a terrifying, rhythmic consistency. He wept when the cameras were present. He paced like a caged predator when they were not. But it was the geometry of the bedroom that kept Miller awake. She had returned to Emily's room 5 times, standing by the open window, measuring the distance to the ground. The intruder theory was beginning to fray under technical scrutiny. Forensics had analyzed the slash screen. The mesh had been cut from the outside, yes, but the angle of the incisions was awkward. A person standing on a ladder would have cut straight across or downward. These cuts were jagged, angled upward, as if someone had reached out from inside the room, pulled the screen toward them, and sliced it to mimic a break-in. "Art," Miller said, pulling him into the kitchen, away from his supporters. "We went over the security footage from the industrial park where you work. Your truck is seen entering the lot at 3:45 p.m. It doesn't leave until 11:15 p.m. The gate logs match your time card." Arthur nodded, his face a mask of weary exhaustion. "I told you. I was at work. I was providing for my girl." "I know what you told me," Miller replied, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "But we also looked at the back perimeter of the plant. There's a hole in the chain-link fence, Art, right behind the loading docks. A hole big enough for a man to slip through. And just beyond that fence is a bike trail that leads directly to the woods behind your house. It's a 20-minute jog. If a man left a station during a dinner break, he could be home and back before anyone noticed he was missing from the floor." Arthur's expression didn't break. Not a twitch. Not a blink. "You think I ran home to kidnap my own daughter?"
Why?
"Why would I do that?" "I don't know why, Art. Maybe she found something out. Maybe the perfect life you two had wasn't so perfect." The tension in the room was a physical weight. Arthur stepped closer, using his height to intimidate, his shadow stretching across the linoleum like a stain. "My wife died in my arms, Detective. Emily was all I had left. You're wasting time chasing me while some monster is out there with my daughter. If she dies because you were busy checking fences, that's on your soul." It was a masterstroke of emotional redirection. Miller felt the sting of it. Without a body, without a witness, and with a father who had a documented alibi at his place of employment, the district attorney wouldn't even look at a warrant. The community was already turning against the police, accusing them of victimizing the victim. The local news ran segments on Arthur's heartbreak, showing him holding Emily's favorite stuffed animal, his voice cracking as he pleaded for her safe return. But then, the first crack in the facade appeared, and it didn't come from the police. It came from the trash. 6 days after the disappearance, a sanitation worker 3 blocks over noticed something odd in a public bin near the community park. It was a heavy-duty black leaf bag, tied shut with a professional-grade zip tie. When he tossed it into the compactor, the bag ripped, spilling its contents onto the metal teeth of the truck. He saw a flash of pink. He stopped the machine. Inside the bag was a blood-soaked pillowcase, a pair of men's leather gloves, and a set of clothes, a girl's pajama top, torn down the middle. Miller was at the scene within minutes. The air was thick with the smell of garbage and rot, but as she looked at the items spread out on a forensic tarp, her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a random abduction. This was an execution of a plan. The leather gloves were a match for the texture of the smudge found on Emily's windowsill. But more importantly, tucked into the thumb of the right glove was a single, short, dark hair. "Run it," Miller commanded. "Run it against Arthur and Emily." The DNA results took 48 hours, the longest 48 hours of Miller's career. When the lab report finally landed on her desk, the world shifted. The blood on the pajamas was Emily's. The hair in the glove belonged to Arthur. But then came the twist that stopped the investigation dead in its tracks. As Miller prepared the arrest warrant, a second report arrived. A forensic sweep of the missing bike trail had turned up a witness, a teenager who had been smoking under the bridge on the night of the 14th. He claimed he saw a man, but it wasn't Arthur Vance. He described a younger man, thinner, with a distinctive tattoo of a serpent on his neck. He saw him carrying a large bundle toward a dark van parked in the shadows. Suddenly, the narrative shattered. Was Arthur being framed? Had someone stolen his gloves from the garage to plant evidence? Or was the witness lying? Before Miller could move, Arthur Vance did something no one expected.
He didn't flee.
He didn't hide. He called a press conference on his front lawn. Standing before a forest of microphones, he announced that he was offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to the real killer. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity, and said, "I know who you are. I know you took her to hurt me. Bring her back, and I won't kill you myself." The public went wild. Arthur was no longer just a grieving father. He was a vigilante hero. The pressure on the police department became unbearable. The serpent tattoo lead was chased into a dead end. The witness later admitted he had been high and might have imagined the tattoo. But the damage was done. Reasonable doubt had been sown like salt into the soil of the case. And then, as quickly as the fire had started, it began to die out. The winter snow turned to spring rain. The missing posters began to fade and peel from the telephone poles. The volunteers stopped showing up. Arthur Vance sold the house on Elm Street, claiming the memories were too much to bear. He moved 3 towns over, took a job in a different factory, and faded into the background of Ohio life. The case of Emily Vance didn't go cold because of a lack of evidence. It went cold because the evidence was a labyrinth of contradictions. The blood, the gloves, the alibi, the mysterious stranger. None of it connected. The file was moved from the active desk to the archives, a thick binder of unanswered questions collecting dust in a windowless room. For 10 years, Arthur Vance lived as a ghost. He never remarried. He never had more children. He was the man who had lost everything, a tragic figure in the periphery of the community. But time is not a healer. It is a slow-motion wrecking ball. While Arthur was building his new, quiet life, the world of science was undergoing a revolution he never saw coming. The dark secret wasn't buried in the woods, and it wasn't hidden in a garage. It was hidden in the very marrow of his bones, waiting for a technology that didn't yet exist to catch up with his lies. In 2024, a young cold case investigator named Leo Rossi picked up the Vance file. He didn't look at the witness statements.
He didn't look at the alibi.
He looked at the DNA. Not just the match or non-match technology of 2010, but the burgeoning field of investigative genetic genealogy. He took the hair from that leather glove, the hair that had been legally linked to Arthur but dismissed as transferred DNA by a clever defense attorney, and he sent it to a private lab in Virginia. He wasn't looking for Arthur. He was looking for Arthur's ancestors. He was looking for the cracks in the family tree where a monster might be hiding. What he found didn't just reopen the case. It ripped the floorboards out from under the entire mystery. The genealogical profile didn't just point to Arthur Vance. It pointed to a shadow identity, a history of violence that spanned 3 states and 30 years. Arthur Vance wasn't who he said he was. He wasn't even Arthur Vance. The man who had wept on national television, the man who had buried a cardinal to prove his innocence, was a man built entirely of smoke and stolen names. And as Rossi dug deeper into the digital graveyard of the Vance family tree, he realized that Emily hadn't been the first to vanish. She was just the only one who had been missed. The digital landscape is a graveyard of secrets, a vast, interconnected web where the past never truly dies. It only waits for someone with the right map to find it. For Leo Rossi, that map was a string of letters, A, C, G, and T. When he uploaded the DNA profile derived from that decade-old hair found in the leather glove, He wasn't just looking for a name. He was looking for a ghost. The initial results from the public genealogy databases didn't return a direct hit. Arthur Vance wasn't in the system, but the software did something far more devastating. It found his cousins. It found a second cousin in Portland, a third cousin in Seattle, and a distant great-aunt in a nursing home in rural Idaho. These people had never heard of an Arthur Vance. They didn't have a single Vance in their family tree, but they did have a Thorne. Specifically, a Caleb Thorne, a man who had vanished from the Pacific Northwest in the late 1990s, leaving behind a trail of bad checks, broken hearts, and a whispered connection to a missing waitress in a small logging town. The realization hit Rossi like a physical blow. The man the community of Akron had spent 14 years pitying was a fiction, a carefully constructed mask worn by a predator who had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. As Rossi cross-referenced the genealogical data with old Social Security records, the facade of the grieving widower began to dissolve into a dark, oily sludge. The real Arthur Vance had been a drifter, a man who died of an overdose in a flophouse in 1998. His identity stolen by Caleb Thorne before the body was even cold. Thorne hadn't just moved to Ohio. He had been reborn there. He had fabricated a life, a marriage, and a history, using the grief of a dead wife who might never have existed to shield himself from any scrutiny. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the stolen name. It was the biological truth revealed by the centimorgans. Emily Vance, the girl whose face had been on every milk carton and billboard in the state, was indeed Caleb Thorne's daughter. But her mother? The woman Thorne claimed had died in his arms 3 years before Emily vanished? There was no record of her death. There was no grave. There was no maiden name. Rossi sat in the blue light of his office, the hum of the cooling fans sounding like a low-frequency scream. He began to look at the 2010 case file through this new, distorted lens. The immaculate house. The organized garage. The perfectly organized tool bench. It wasn't the home of a grieving father. It was the lair of a man who lived in a constant state of tactical readiness. The bird burial that had so effectively neutralized Detective Miller's suspicion was no longer a touching moment of parental empathy. It was a calculated test. Thorne had used the cardinal to see if the police would dig, to see if he could manipulate their emotions with a simple, bloody prop. And it had worked. For 14 years, the truth had been buried under the weight of a false narrative, protected by the very community that Thorne had manipulated into believing he was one of them. The investigation now shifted from a search for a missing girl to a hunt for a serial pretender. Rossi started tracing Thorne's movements after he sold the house on Elm Street. The man had been a chameleon, moving every 3 to 4 years, always taking jobs in heavy industry where he could remain a face in the crowd, always choosing towns that had recently suffered their own tragedies, where his grief would blend in with the local atmosphere. He was currently living in a small, clapboard house in a dying steel town near the Pennsylvania border, under yet another name. But he was still keeping the same patterns. He was still the quiet neighbor. He was still the man who kept his lawn trimmed and his curtains drawn. He was still the man who carried a secret in his marrow that was finally, after a decade and a half, beginning to leak out. Rossi knew he couldn't just knock on the door. He needed more than a genealogical link to a stolen identity. He needed the location of Emily. He needed to know what happened in those 20 minutes when Caleb Thorne, not Arthur Vance, slipped through the hole in the factory fence and jogged through the frozen woods toward his home. He revisited the forensic photos of the backyard, zooming in until the pixels broke apart into jagged squares. He looked at the footprints again. 2 sets. One large, one small, standing static under the window. In 2010, the police assumed someone had caught her as she jumped. But Rossi saw something else. He saw a rehearsal. He saw a man who had stood in that spot days before, measuring the drop, calculating the angles, practicing the abduction so that when the night came, he could perform it with the precision of a stage play. The psychological profile of Caleb Thorne began to emerge, a man addicted to the control of the narrative, a man who derived power from being the only person in the room who knew the truth. Every tear shed at a press conference was a victory. Every prayer offered by a neighbor was a trophy. He hadn't just killed his daughter. He had made the entire world participate in his mourning of her. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Rossi felt a cold shiver of dread as he realized that Emily might not have been the end of the story. If Thorne was a man who lived by cycles of reinvention and destruction, then what had he been doing in the 14 years since he left Akron? How many other identities had he discarded? How many other daughters had been lost in the static of his transitions? The detective began to pull the threads of Thorne's life before Ohio, reaching back into the fog of the 1990s. He found a report from a sheriff's office in Oregon about a young woman named Sarah who had gone missing from a diner. Her boyfriend at the time? A man fitting Thorne's description, who had disappeared the same day she did. Then, a similar story from a suburb in Colorado. A devoted husband, whose wife had walked out and never been seen again. No bodies were ever found. No charges were ever filed. Thorne was a master of the clean break, leaving behind just enough doubt to keep the police at bay until the trail went cold. He didn't just hide bodies, he hid entire lives. But the DNA was the one thing he couldn't leave behind. It was the invisible witness, the silent whistleblower that had followed him from the logging camps of the Northwest to the industrial heart of Ohio. Rossi worked with a forensic geologist to analyze the soil samples from the shovel, the same samples that had been dismissed because of the dead bird story. The new analysis showed something the 2010 lab had missed: microscopic traces of lime. High-calcium lime, the kind used to accelerate decomposition or neutralize odors in a shallow grave. It wasn't just dirt from a flower bed, it was soil that had been chemically altered. The realization sent Rossi back to the maps of the Elm Street property. He didn't look at the flower beds. He looked at the house itself. In 2010, the police had searched the woods, the garage, and the living quarters. But the house sat on a crawlspace, a narrow, dark void between the floorboards and the earth, accessible only through a small, hidden hatch in the back of the master bedroom closet. The original investigators had glanced inside, seen nothing but dust and cobwebs, and moved on. But Thorne was a man of meticulous organization. He wouldn't have put her in the woods where a dog might find her or a hiker might stumble upon her. He would have kept her close. He would have kept her under his feet, literally, so he could walk over her every day, a secret foundation for his new life. Rossi felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of triumph and absolute horror. The mysterious disappearance wasn't a kidnapping, it was a domestic burial. The strange clue wasn't the open window, it was the house itself. He began to draft the affidavit for a new search warrant, not for the current residence of the man now known as Arthur Vance, but for the old house on Elm Street. He knew that the new owners had lived there for a decade, oblivious to the potential horror beneath their feet. They had raised their own children in those rooms. They had slept in the bedroom where Emily once dreamed. They had lived a life of mundane peace on top of a tomb. As he typed, the weight of the years seemed to press down on him. 14 years of a father's lies. 14 years of a community's misplaced sympathy. 14 years of Emily Vance waiting in the dark. The cold case wasn't just ending, it was exploding. The genealogical testing hadn't just lulled a secret out of the shadows, it had turned a spotlight on a monster who had convinced the world he was a martyr. And as the sun began to rise over the Akron skyline, casting long, cold shadows across the frost-covered streets, Leo Rossi knew that the next 24 hours would change everything. The silence of Elm Street was about to be broken for the last time. The warrant was signed at 4:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, the ink still wet as Leo Rossi accelerated toward the old Vance property on Elm Street. The air was thick with a biting, wet fog, a mirror of the night Emily had vanished 14 years prior. The current owners of the house, the Miller family, were woken by the jarring, rhythmic strobing of police lights against their bedroom walls, a nightmare they never invited, a legacy they didn't know they had inherited. As they stood on the sidewalk, wrapped in blankets and shivering with a confusion that would soon turn to trauma, a team of specialized recovery experts moved in. They didn't go to the woods. They didn't check the garage. They went straight for the master bedroom closet. Inside the closet, the smell of lavender sachets and clean laundry hung in the air, a domestic mask for the void beneath. Rossi pulled back the carpet, his heart hammering a frantic code against his ribs. There it was, the square wooden hatch, painted over so many times it had almost fused with the floor. With a pry bar and a sharp, splintering crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent house, the seal was broken. A gust of air rushed out from the crawl space, stale, cold, and carrying the unmistakable, heavy scent of damp earth and ancient dust. It was the breath of a tomb. The forensic team lowered themselves into the darkness, their high-powered LED beams cutting through the gloom like surgical lasers. The space was barely 3 feet high, a claustrophobic maze of support beams and rusted pipes. For the first 20 minutes, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and the metallic scrape of trowels against the dirt. The ground here was dry, protected from the Ohio rain for decades, but near the north corner, beneath what would have been Arthur Vance's side of the bed, the earth looked different. It was sunken, a slight, rectangular depression in the silt, barely visible to the untrained eye. "Here," a technician whispered. The word felt heavy, sinking into the silence of the crawl space. As they began to brush away the top layer of dirt, the horror of Caleb Thorne's meticulous organization revealed its final, grotesque chapter. He hadn't just dug a hole. He had lined the grave with plastic sheeting to prevent moisture from reaching the floorboards above. He had used the lime Rossi had identified in the soil samples, a white, caustic powder that had turned the earth into a gray, chalky slurry. And then 6 inches down, they found it, a flash of pink. Faded, brittle, but unmistakably the fabric of a girl's pajama sleeve. The recovery was a slow, agonizing process. Piece by piece, the story of that night was reconstructed in reverse. They found the duct tape. They found the zip ties. And finally, they found Emily. She had been placed there with a terrifying, clinical precision, her hands folded, a twisted parody of sleep. There was no signs of a struggle in the grave, because the struggle had ended long before she reached the crawl space. The abduction through the window had been a silent, vertical transit, not out into the world, but down into the dark. While the recovery team worked in the shadows of Elm Street, a tactical unit was moving in on the man currently known as David Barrett in the steel town 40 miles away. Caleb Thorne was sitting on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sunrise with the calm, detached gaze of a man who believed he had outrun God himself. He didn't run when the black SUV screeched to a halt at his curb. He didn't scream when the red lasers danced across his chest. He simply set his coffee down, stood up, and held out his wrists. "What took you so long?" he asked, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that held no remorse, only a chilling, arrogant curiosity. In the interrogation room, the mask didn't just slip, it evaporated. Thorne didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't deny the DNA. He sat under the harsh fluorescent lights and began to talk, his voice devoid of the theatrical grief he had performed for a decade. He spoke about Emily not as a daughter, but as a complication. He spoke about the night of November 14th as a series of logistics. She had found the box, he explained. The box under the floorboards in the garage. The box containing the IDs of the women from Oregon and Colorado. The box of trophies from a life he had tried to bury. "She looked at me differently that morning," Thorne said, his eyes unfocused, as if he were watching a movie only he could see. "The trust was gone. And once the trust is gone, the risk becomes unacceptable. I loved her in my way, but I love my freedom more." The chilling reality of the Ohio 2010 cold case was that it was never a mystery to the man at the center of it. It was a performance. The open window, the slash screen, the intruder footprints. He had spent weeks choreographing the scene, even going so far as to buy a pair of boots 2 sizes too large to create the false tracks in the frost. He had timed his jog from the factory to the second, knowing exactly when the security cameras would be pointing away from the fence. He had even killed the cardinal and buried it in the flower bed 2 days before the murder, a preemptive strike against any police curiosity about his shovel. As the news of the discovery broke, the community of Akron was plunged into a second, deeper wave of shock. The community shock the headlines had shouted about in 2010 was nothing compared to the visceral, sickening realization that they had comforted a monster. The neighbors who had brought him casseroles, the pastor who had prayed with him, the police officers who had hesitated to press him, they all realized they had been props in his play. The betrayal was absolute. The mysterious disappearance had been solved, but the resolution brought no peace, only a haunting, lingering sense of violation. Rossi stood outside the interrogation room, watching Thorne through the one-way glass. The genealogical testing hadn't just caught a killer, it had unmasked a predator who used the very structures of human empathy to hide his tracks. Thorne was a reminder that the most dangerous monsters don't hide in the woods, they hide behind a trimmed hedge, a steady job, and a tragic story. The dark secret was finally out, but the impact of it would ripple through the state for generations. The case was closed, the cold had finally been burned away by the white-hot truth of the DNA, but the memory of Emily Vance would remain a permanent frost on the soul of the town. She was no longer a face on a poster. She was a girl who had been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to protect her, a victim of a man who had turned his own home into a theater of the macabre. As the sun set on the final day of the investigation, the wind on Elm Street finally went silent, as if the house itself were finally catching its breath after 14 years of holding a terrible, suffocating secret. The confession of Caleb Thorne didn't just close a file, it ignited a firestorm that consumed the national news cycle for months. The headlines were no longer about a mysterious disappearance or a shattered community. They were about the father of lies, a man who had engineered a decade of deception with the cold, calculating precision of a master architect. The media descended on the small steel town where he was captured and returned in a ravenous swarm to Elm Street, where the Miller family's home had become a macabre landmark, a site of suburban pilgrimage for the morbidly curious. But inside the walls of the Summit County Jail, the atmosphere was different. It was quiet. It was clinical. It was the sound of a legal machine grinding toward a conclusion that everyone wanted, but no one truly understood. The trial of the state of Ohio versus Caleb Thorne, alias Arthur Vance, became a landmark in the history of American jurisprudence. It wasn't just about the murder of Emily Vance. It was the first major test of investigative genetic genealogy in a capital murder case involving a stolen identity. The courtroom was packed every morning at 7 a.m., a sea of faces, reporters, former neighbors, and most poignantly, the relatives of the missing women from Oregon and Colorado. They had flown across the country, drawn by the sudden, violent light Thorne's confession had shed on their own cold grief. They sat in the back rows, clutching worn photographs of women who had vanished decades ago, watching the man who had stolen their peace as he sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his expression as unreadable as a slab of granite. Thorne's defense team attempted a desperate, multi-pronged strategy. They moved to suppress the DNA evidence, arguing that the use of public genealogy databases constituted an illegal search, a violation of the Fourth Amendment. They claimed that Arthur Vance's identity was a result of a dissociative fugue state, a psychological break brought on by the trauma of his first wife's death, a woman they still couldn't prove existed. But the prosecution, led by a relentless district attorney named Helena Vance, no relation, a coincidence the media found darkly poetic, met every motion with a mountain of forensic reality. They didn't just have the DNA, they had the trophy box. During the second week of the trial, the prosecution introduced the contents of that hidden box found in the crawl space, items Thorne had moved from house to house for 20 years. It was a museum of misery. A silver locket belonging to Sarah from Oregon, a high school ring from the woman in Colorado, and, most devastatingly, a diary Emily had started just weeks before her death. The entries were read aloud in a courtroom so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The girl's words were a haunting countdown. She wrote about her father's new moods, about how he would stand in her doorway at night just watching her, and finally, about the day she found the loose floorboard in the garage. Dad isn't who he says he is. The last entry read, the handwriting shaky and rushed. I found the names. I'm scared to ask him. I think I need to leave. The emotional climax of the trial came when Leo Rossi took the stand. He didn't speak with the bravado of a hero. He spoke with the weary clarity of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen the monster staring back. He walked the jury through the genealogical map, showing how a single hair from a leather glove had acted as a tether, pulling Thorne back through time. He showed the jury the photographs of the crawlspace, the gray lime, and the pink pajamas. But it was when he looked directly at Thorne that the room felt the true weight of the moment. He didn't just kill her, Rossi testified, his voice low and steady. He curated her death. He turned her memory into a weapon he used against anyone who tried to help him. Thorne's reaction was the most chilling part of the entire proceeding. He didn't look away. He didn't bow his head. He watched Rossi with a slight, almost imperceptible smirk, a look of professional respect from one hunter to another. It was the look of a man who knew he had lost the game, but was still admiring the move that checkmated him. He refused to testify in his own defense, but he insisted on making a statement during the sentencing phase. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for mercy. He spoke for 10 minutes about the inevitability of the outcome, describing his life as a series of necessary adjustments. To the families in the back row, it was a final verbal assault, a refusal to grant them the one thing they needed, a flicker of human remorse. The jury took less than 4 hours to return a verdict. Guilty on all counts: aggravated murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and identity theft. The judge, a woman known for her ironclad composure, found her voice cracking as she handed down the sentence: life without the possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security facility. "You are a man who built a life out of shadows," she told him. "It is only fitting that you spend the rest of it in one." But the lingering shock didn't end with the gavel. The case had opened a Pandora's box of questions about the safety of our digital identities and the ease with which a predator can slip through the cracks of a mobile, modern society. Investigative genetic genealogy became the new frontier of law enforcement, with departments across the country dusting off their own cold cases, hoping to find their own Caleb Thornes. The Emily Vance Law was drafted, mandating stricter verification for identity documents and more robust funding for cold case units. But for the community of Akron, the lingering impact was more personal. Elm Street would never be the same. The house at 4202 was eventually purchased by a land trust and demolished, the earth beneath it excavated and replaced with fresh soil. They planted a grove of white oaks there, a living memorial to a girl who had been buried in the dark. But the neighbors still crossed the street when they walked past. The strange clues and mysterious disappearances that had once been the stuff of sensational headlines were now part of the local DNA. Parents held their children a little tighter. They looked at the quiet, helpful man next door with a new, sharp edge of suspicion. The trust that holds a community together had been permanently frayed. As the years passed, the Ohio 2010 cold case became a staple of true crime documentaries and psychological studies. Experts dissected Thorne's meticulous organization, trying to find the point where his humanity had curdled into sociopathy. They looked for the dark secret in his childhood, but they found only more shadows, more stolen names. He remained a cipher, a man who had successfully erased his own beginning, leaving behind only a trail of endings. The final image of the saga, captured by a lone photographer as Thorne was being transported to the state penitentiary, was of him looking out the window of the van. He wasn't looking at the cameras or the protesters. He was looking at the horizon, at the vast, open expanse of the Ohio landscape. He looked like a man who was already planning his next identity, his next move, even in a world of concrete and steel. But the world knew him now. The DNA had stripped him of his masks. He was no longer Arthur Vance, the grieving father. He was Caleb Thorne, the man who was finally, irrevocably, caught in the light of the truth. And in the quiet moments of the night, when the wind screams through Summit County and the frost begins to bloom on the glass, the people of Elm Street still remember. They remember the blue eyes and the shy smile of Emily Vance. They remember the man who wept for her on the lawn. And they remember that the most terrifying secrets are the ones that sleep right beneath your feet, waiting for the decades to pass, waiting for the truth to rise, as cold and unyielding as the Ohio winter. While Caleb Thorne sat in his 6 by 9 foot cell, the shock waves of his conviction traveled backward through time, vibrating across state lines and into the forgotten corners of the Pacific Northwest. The resolution of the Emily Vance case wasn't a finale. It was a prologue for the families of the women Thorne had discarded like spent matches in the years before he became Arthur Vance. In Oregon, the file on Sarah, the waitress who disappeared in 1994, was pulled from a moldering basement archive. In Colorado, the missing persons report for a young mother named Rebecca was finally upgraded to a homicide investigation. The world was beginning to realize that Emily hadn't been an isolated tragedy. She was the final casualty in a decades-long campaign of predatory reinvention. The investigation into Thorne's prior lives became a massive federal undertaking, a forensic archaeological dig into the 1990s. Detective Leo Rossi, now working in tandem with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, began to map the shadow trail Thorne had left behind. They found that Thorne's method was always the same. He would find a woman in a state of transition, recently divorced, grieving a parent, or new to a town, and he would become exactly what she needed. He was a chameleon of empathy. He would marry them, mesh his life with theirs, and then, when the boredom set in or the risk of exposure grew too high, he would clean the slate. The trophy box found under the Elm Street house became the Rosetta Stone for these cold cases. Forensic technicians spent months analyzing the silver locket and the high school ring, using microscopic wear patterns and trace DNA to link them to specific dates and locations. They discovered that Thorne didn't just take jewelry, he took identities. He had used Rebecca's credit history to establish his first bank account in Ohio. He had used Sarah's social security number to apply for his first job at the auto plant. He was a parasite who didn't just kill his victims, he consumed their existence to fuel his next transformation. As the federal team dug into the Oregon woods where Sarah was last seen, they found a chilling consistency. Thorne had a signature that the 2010 investigators had completely missed because they were looking for a stranger, not a husband. He buried his secrets near water, but always above the flood line. He used the same heavy-duty plastic sheeting. He used the same brand of lime. It was as if he were following a manual he had written for himself, a blueprint for the perfect disappearance. When they finally recovered Sarah's remains in a remote clearing near the Columbia River, she was found in the same, folded, position as Emily. The symmetry was nauseating. It was the mark of a man who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as inventory to be filed away. The media coverage of these legacy victims turned the Caleb Thorne story from a local crime drama into a national obsession with this serial identity killer. The public was fascinated and horrified by the idea of a man who could live a double life for 14 years without a single slip-up. Psychologists appeared on talk shows to discuss the mask of sanity, pointing to Thorne as the ultimate example of a high-functioning sociopath. But for the families of the victims, the psychological labels were cold comfort. They didn't care about his mask, they cared about the decades of birthdays, holidays, and milestones he had stolen. In a small town in Colorado, Rebecca's daughter, who was only 3 years old when her mother disappeared, watched the news of Thorne's sentencing with a mixture of relief and renewed agony. She had grown up believing her mother had simply abandoned her, a narrative Thorne had carefully planted with neighbors and local police before he vanished. Now, 25 years later, she had to reconcile the mother she thought didn't love her with the mother who had been murdered by the man she called Daddy. The lingering shock wasn't just about death, it was about the total destruction of a person's history. Thorne didn't just kill people, he murdered the truth of their lives. Back in the Ohio prison, Thorne remained a source of dark fascination for the guards and other inmates. He didn't join a gang, he didn't seek protection. He spent his days in the library, reading books on genealogy and law, occasionally writing letters to the Miller family, the current owners of the Elm Street property, offering advice on how to maintain the Oak Grove. The letters were intercepted, of course, but their contents leaked, adding to his legend as a man who couldn't stop trying to control the narrative, even from behind bars. He seemed to relish the attention, the way his name had become a shorthand for suburban terror. The legal system, meanwhile, was struggling to keep up with the Thorne effect. The case had exposed a massive vulnerability in the way state and federal agencies shared data. A man could be a person of interest in a disappearance in Oregon and a Citizen of the Year candidate in Ohio, and the two systems would never talk to each other. New protocols were established, and the Thorn database was created, a centralized hub for missing persons that used AI to cross-reference travel patterns, employment records, and genealogical data. It was a high-tech net designed to catch the next Caleb Thorn before he could finish his first rehearsal. But as the technological net tightened, the emotional wounds in Akron remained raw. The demolition of the house at 4202 Elm Street hadn't brought the closure the neighborhood expected. Instead, the empty lot became a silent, accusatory finger. People would drive by and see the white oaks, and instead of thinking of Emily's life, they thought of the gray line. They thought of the 14 years of normalcy that had been a lie. The community was haunted not by a ghost, but by its own capacity to be deceived. They realized that if Caleb Thorn could be their neighbor, then anyone could be anyone. Leo Rossi, now a lead investigator for the state's cold case task force, found himself unable to move on. He kept a photo of Emily on his desk, not the smiling one from the Amber Alert, but a photo of the trophy box being pulled from the earth. To him, that box represented the reality of the work, the slow, grinding process of stripping away the lies. He knew that for every Caleb Thorn they caught, there were others out there, men who had mastered the art of the clean break, men who were currently sitting at a kitchen table somewhere in America, pretending to be a father, pretending to be a husband, pretending to be human. The Ohio 2010 cold case had ended, but the story of Caleb Thorn was far from over. It had become a permanent part of the American Gothic, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a well-manicured lawn and a tragic smile. The genealogical testing had lulled the secret out, but it couldn't erase the damage. As the sun set over the Ohio penitentiary, casting long, barred shadows across Thorn Cell, the world outside continued to watch the horizon, waiting for the next secret to rise from the frost. The transition from the manicured lawns of suburban Ohio to the sterile, echoing geometry of the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility was, for Caleb Thorn, a descent into a specific kind of hell. For a man whose entire existence was predicated on the absolute control of his environment, the prison was not just a cage, it was a psychological deconstruction. He was no longer the architect, he was a component. He was no longer Arthur Vance, the tragic widower, or David Barrett, the quiet laborer. He was inmate 782 to 419, a number stamped into the fabric of a rough orange jumpsuit, a data point in a system that cared nothing for his narratives. But inside the mind of this serial identity killer, the gears were still turning, grinding against the reality of his confinement, seeking a new way to dominate a world that had finally shrunk to the size of a stone cell. The psychological breakdown began not with a scream, but with a silence so profound it unnerved the veteran correctional officers. For the first 6 months, Thorn did not speak. He didn't participate in yard time. He didn't buy items from the commissary. He didn't even acknowledge the presence of the guards during the count. He sat on his bunk, staring at the concrete wall with an intensity that suggested he was trying to look through it, back into the past, or perhaps into a future he was still trying to script. The prison psychologists labeled it situational depression, but Leo Rossi, who monitored the reports from his office in Akron, knew better. Thorn wasn't depressed. He was recalibrating. He was a predator in a new habitat, observing the patterns, the weaknesses, and the rhythms of the concrete labyrinth. Then came the letters. Not out to the world, but in from a ghost. In the fall of 2025, a series of envelopes began arriving at the prison, postmarked from a small, dying town in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky. They were addressed to Caleb Thorn, a name he hadn't used legally in 30 years. The return address was always the same, a P.O. box in a town called Blackwood, but there was no name. Inside were no words, only old, yellowed newspaper clippings from the late 1970s. Headlines about unexplained fires, missing livestock, and a tragic hunting accident. Rossi, alerted by the prison mailroom, flew to Kentucky within 48 hours. He realized that the Ohio 2010 cold case had a subterranean root system that stretched far deeper than the logging camps of Oregon. Thorne hadn't been born a monster in the 90s. He had been cultivated in the dark hollows of the South. The investigation into Thorne's childhood shadow revealed a terrifying possibility. Caleb Thorne might not have acted alone in his early years. Rossi began to piece together the history of the Thorne family in Blackwood. They were a clan of isolationists, a family whispered about in the local taverns as the Bone Pickers. Caleb's mother, Martha Thorne, had been a woman of iron-fisted religious mania and documented cruelty. His father had vanished when Caleb was 12, a disappearance that was never investigated by the local sheriff, who was reportedly terrified of the Thorne name. But it was the brother, Silas Thorne, who caught Rossi's attention. Silas, the older brother, the protector, the man who had supposedly died in a house fire in 1982. But there was no death certificate for Silas Thorne. There was no grave in the family plot. This strange clue of the letter suggested that the accomplice from Thorne's youth, the man who might have taught him how to clean the slate, was still alive. The psychological warfare Thorne was conducting from his cell took on a new, darker dimension. Was he communicating with a mentor? Was the trophy box under the Elm Street house just one of several? The community shock that had followed Emily's discovery began to mutate into a broader, national fear. If Thorne was part of a lineage of predators, how many other discarded lives were buried in the Appalachian soil? Back in the prison, Thorne's silence finally broke. He requested a meeting with the prison chaplain, but not for spiritual guidance. He wanted to discuss the ethics of legacy. The chaplain would later describe the encounter as the most disturbing 30 minutes of his life. Thorne didn't talk about Emily or the women from the Northwest. He talked about his mother. He talked about the lessons of the hollow. He spoke about how some people are born to be the grass and others are born to be the scythe. The mistake the police made, Thorne told the chaplain, his voice a dry, rasping hiss, was thinking I was the beginning of the story. I am merely the most successful chapter. The deadlock of the investigation in Kentucky mirrored the deadlock of Thorne's mind. He began to exhibit signs of a genuine mental fracture, or perhaps it was another layer of his performance. He started reenacting his crimes in his cell, using scraps of paper and thread to create dolls that he would bury in the corners of the room. He would talk to them, calling them by the names of the women he had killed: Sarah, Rebecca, Emily. He was turning his cell into a miniature version of the Elm Street crawlspace, a theater of the macabre where he was once again the master of ceremonies. The lingering shock for the guards was the realization that Thorne wasn't suffering from his memories. He was savoring them. But the haunting memories weren't just staying inside the prison walls. In Blackwood, Rossi found a local woman, now in her 80s, who remembered the young Caleb Thorne. She described him as a boy who could walk through a forest without snapping a twig, a boy who would watch people from the shadows for hours, unmoving. She told Rossi about the night of the red sky, when the Thorne barn burned down. She claimed she saw two figures walking away from the flames, one tall and broad, the other smaller, leaner. She said they weren't running. They were strolling, as if they were enjoying the warmth of the destruction. The tall one? Rossi asked, his heart sinking. Was that Silas? It was the shadow of Silas, she whispered. In this town, the Thornes don't die. They just change their names and move to the next hollow. The realization hit Rossi with the force of a tidal wave. The genealogical testing had found Caleb, but it hadn't found the source. The dark secret was a contagion, a family business of erasure. He began to look at the Arthur Vance identity through this new lens. Had Silas been the one who provided the initial documents? Was there a network of Thornes operating under the radar of American society, stealing identities and cleaning slates across the country? The Ohio 2010 cold case was no longer a cold case. It was a map to a hidden world of predators. Thorne seemed to sense that Rossi was closing in on the Kentucky connection. His behavior in prison shifted again. He became hyper-violent, attacking a guard with a sharpened toothbrush, not to escape, but to be moved to solitary confinement. He wanted to be alone with his dolls. He wanted to be back in the crawl space of his mind. In the darkness of the hole, he began to sing a low, melodic Appalachian folk song about a girl lost in the woods. The sound echoed through the ventilation shafts, a chilling, rhythmic reminder that even in chains, Caleb Thorne was still the architect of agony. The lingering impact on Leo Rossi was profound. He stopped going home. He lived in his office, surrounded by the photos of the missing, the maps of the hollows, and the genealogical charts that now resembled a spider's web. He realized that the emotional climax of the trial hadn't been the end. The haunting memories were growing. He felt like he was chasing a ghost that was laughing at him from every shadow. The cold case had become a permanent winter in his soul. And then the final letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to Thorne. It was addressed to Rossi. Inside was a single photograph, taken recently. It showed the white oak grove on Elm Street in Akron. In the foreground, standing near the spot where Emily had been found, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with his back to the camera. He was wearing a grease-stained blue shirt, just like the one Arthur Vance had worn. Underneath the photo, a single line was written in a cramped, archaic hand. "The harvest is almost ready, detective. Are you?" The mysterious disappearance had come full circle. This strange clue was a direct threat. The community shock was about to be reignited. Caleb Thorne was in a cage, but the legacy of the scythe was still out there, walking the streets of Ohio, watching the oaks grow, waiting for the frost to return. The Ohio 2010 cold case had ended, but the Thorne family story was just beginning its bloodiest chapter. The silence of the night was broken once again, not by the wind, but by the realization that the monster you catch is only as dangerous as the one you haven't seen yet. The road into Blackwood, Kentucky, wasn't a road so much as a scar across the landscape, a winding ribbon of cracked asphalt that choked on the encroaching kudzu and the weight of the humidity. Leo Rossi drove into the heart of the Appalachian foothills with the windows rolled up, the air conditioning struggling against a heat that felt ancient and heavy. He was 400 miles from the ruins of Elm Street, but the shadow of Caleb Thorne felt longer here, cast by the jagged ridges that blocked out the sun. The strange clue of the photograph, the man in the blue work shirt standing in Emily's oak grove, had turned Rossi from a detective into a hunter. He wasn't looking for a motive anymore. He was looking for Silas Thorne, the phantom patriarch of a lineage built on disappearance. The town of Blackwood was a skeletal remains of the coal boom, a collection of sagging porches and rusted tin roofs that seemed to be sliding slowly into the muddy banks of the Cumberland River. The community shock here wasn't a recent event. It was a permanent state of being, a generational trauma etched into the faces of the men sitting on milk crates outside the general store. They watched Rossi's sedan with a flat, predatory indifference. In a town where secrets were the only currency that never devalued, a man in a suit with an Ohio plate was a debt no one wanted to collect. Rossi started at the county courthouse, a crumbling brick building that smelled of damp paper and tobacco spit. The records room was a chaotic labyrinth of unorganized files, but Rossi had the patience of a man who had already spent 14 years in the dark. He wasn't looking for a birth certificate anymore. He was looking for the accidental deaths. He found them buried in the margins of the 1970s ledger, a string of falls, house fires, and hunting mishaps that always seemed to occur on the perimeter of the Thorne property. And at the center of every report was a signature that made Rossi's blood run cold: Sheriff Miller, the same name as the first officer on the scene in Akron. A coincidence? Or a legacy of protection that spanned generations? He tracked the Thorne homestead to a secluded hollow 6 miles north of the town limits. The driveway was a jagged track of mud and limestone, barred by a rusted gate draped in "no trespassing" signs that looked like they had been lettered in blood. Rossi left his car and continued on foot, his hand resting on the grip of a service weapon. The silence of the Kentucky woods was different from the silence of an Ohio suburb. It wasn't empty, it was watchful. The birds didn't sing, they clicked. The wind didn't blow, it breathed through the hemlocks with a wet, raspy sound. As he rounded the final bend, the Thorne house emerged from the fog like a ghost ship. It was a sprawling, three-story Victorian monstrosity that had been stripped of its paint by decades of neglect. The porch had collapsed in the center, looking like a mouth with broken teeth. This was the cradle of the scythe, the place where Caleb Thorne had learned that a house could be a weapon and a floorboard could be a tomb. "You're trespassing, detective," a voice rasped from the shadows of the porch. Rossi froze. He scanned the darkness, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Sitting in a high-backed rocker that creaked with every movement was a woman who looked like she was carved from the very timber of the house. Her skin was a map of deep, translucent wrinkles, and her eyes were a piercing, milky blue, the same eyes that had looked at the cameras in 2010. Martha Thorne, the mother, the woman the world thought had died in the unexplained fire of 1982. "I'm looking for Silas," Rossi said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. Martha let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a death rattle. "Silas is the wind, boy. Silas is the frost. You don't find Silas. He finds the things that are meant to be harvested." She stood up, her movements fluid and hauntingly graceful for a woman of her age. She walked to the edge of the porch, the light catching the silver locket around her neck, a locket Rossi recognized from the trophy box. "Caleb was always the weak one," she whispered, looking out toward the dark line of the woods.
"He needed the names.
He needed the masks. He wanted to be loved by the world he was destroying. But Silas understands the beauty of the void. He doesn't need a name to be the hand of God." The psychological breakdown Rossi had witnessed in Caleb's cell suddenly made sense. Caleb wasn't the master. He was the imitation. He had spent his life trying to recreate the perfect silence of his older brother, building a suburban parody of the horror Silas lived naturally. The dark secret wasn't a single murder. It was an ideology of erasure. Martha Thorne wasn't just a mother. She was the curator of a cult of two. Rossi moved toward the house, but Martha raised a hand, and the clicking in the wood stopped. From the shadows of the trees, three large, silent dogs emerged, gray-muzzled hounds with eyes that held no light. They didn't growl. They didn't bark. They just waited. "You have no jurisdiction in the hollow, detective," Martha said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic hum, the same song Caleb had been singing in solitary confinement. "The law of the land ends at the gate. The law of the thorn begins here." She turned and retreated into the darkness of the house, the heavy oak door thudding shut with a finality that shook the earth. Rossi stood alone in the clearing, the hounds watching him with a terrifying, intelligent patience. He realized then that the Ohio 2010 cold case had been a trap, not for Caleb, but for the truth. By catching Caleb, Rossi had alerted the real monster that the silence had been breached. The photograph in the oak grove wasn't just a threat, it was a lure. Silas wanted him here. Silas wanted him in the hollow. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, plunging the hollow into a premature, oily darkness, Rossi felt a presence behind him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting a bright, desperate path through the mist. There, carved into the bark of a massive, ancient oak tree, were two words, fresh and sap-bleeding. "Emily waits." The emotional climax hit him then, a realization of such profound horror it made his knees buckle. Emily wasn't just a victim Caleb had discarded. She was a sacrifice to a legacy she had accidentally discovered. The deadlock wasn't between a detective and a killer. It was between the modern world and an ancient, predatory darkness that had never left the woods. Rossi realized that he couldn't leave. If he left, the legacy of the scythe would follow him back to Akron, back to the Miller family, back to everyone who had ever touched the Vance case. He stayed in the woods that night, huddled in the hollow of a fallen log, listening to the rhythmic hyperventilation of the forest. He heard the footsteps, the same large, heavy boot prints from the 2010 frost, circling his position, never coming close enough to be seen, but never far enough to be forgotten. Silas Thorne was hunting him, not for his life, but for his fear. He was being curated. The lingering impact of that night would change the course of American law enforcement. It was the night the Thorn Task Force became a ghost hunting unit, a group dedicated to finding the men who live between the records. But for Leo Rossi, it was the night he understood that some cases never close, they just grow deeper, like roots in a grave. As the first light of dawn began to gray the Kentucky sky, Rossi saw a figure standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. A tall, broad man in a blue work shirt, holding a long-handled shovel. He didn't move.
He didn't speak.
He just watched. The Ohio 2010 cold case had ended in a courtroom, but the battle for the soul of the Hollow was just beginning. The haunting memories were now a living, breathing reality. The strange clue was the man on the ridge. And as Rossi stood up, his bones aching from the cold and the terror, he knew that the only way to end the story was to go into the house. To go into the heart of the bone pickers. To finish what the DNA had started. The door did not resist. When Leo Rossi placed his palm against the heavy, salt-grayed oak of the Thorn homestead, it swung inward with a silent, well-oiled smoothness that felt like an invitation to a slaughterhouse. The transition from the humid, predatory air of the Kentucky Hollow to the interior of the house was a sensory assault. Outside, the world was wrought and kudzu. Inside, it was a cathedral of sterile, obsessive preservation. The air smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and a sharp, chemical undertone of formaldehyde, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like a coat of oil. Rossi stepped over the threshold, his flashlight beam cutting through a darkness so thick it felt tangible, illuminating a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves. This was not a home. It was an archive, a monument to the erased. As Rossi moved deeper into the house, the meticulous organization that had defined Caleb Thorne's life in Ohio was revealed as a mere shadow of the obsession contained within these walls. The shelves were packed with thousands of meticulously labeled binders, their spines marked with dates and geographical coordinates. He pulled one from the shelf at random, September 1984, Boise, Idaho, blue sedan. Inside were newspaper clippings of a missing college student, a set of keys, a lock of hair, and a series of photographs taken from the shadows of a parking lot. There was no name on the binder, only the date and the method. This was the Library of Lost Lives. It was the physical manifestation of the Thorn legacy, a record of 50 years of human existence reduced to trophies and metadata. Rossi realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that the Ohio 2010 cold case was just a single paragraph in a sprawling, multi-generational epic of predatory violence. The Thorns didn't just kill, they cataloged. They treated human lives like a harvest, and this house was the granary. You're looking at the history of the invisible. Martha Thorne's voice drifted down from the upper landing, a ghostly echo in the vast, hollow space. She was standing in the shadows, her form illuminated only by the faint, gray light filtering through the stained glass windows of the foyer. Every name in this room is a person the world decided it didn't need anymore.
We didn't take them, Detective.
We just picked them up after they fell through the cracks. Where is Silas? Rossi shouted, his voice cracking the unnatural silence of the archive. He kept his flashlight trained on the binders, afraid that if he turned it away, the room would swallow him whole. Silas is the librarian, she replied, her footsteps clicking softly as she descended the stairs. He's the one who kept the records when Caleb went soft. Caleb wanted to be part of the world. He wanted the Vance name. He wanted the daughter. He wanted to pretend the harvest had a heart. But Silas knows that a record is the only thing that lasts. Rossi ignored her, pushing past the shelves toward the back of the house. He found himself in a large, circular room that served as the heart of a library. In the center sat a massive, hand-carved oak desk, and on it, a ledger lay open. The handwriting was different from Caleb's frantic, tight script. This was archaic, elegant, and chillingly steady. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. It contained the address of the Miller family in Akron, a detailed map of the oak grove, and a single, terrifying sentence: the root must be pulled to save the tree. The strange clue of the photograph in the woods wasn't a threat of a new murder. It was a plan for a total erasure. Silas wasn't just coming for Rossi. He was going back to Elm Street to destroy every trace of the investigation, every person who had touched the Vance secret. The community shock was about to be replaced by a massacre. "He's not here, is he?" Rossi turned to Martha, his gun leveled at the dark space behind her. "He's already on his way back to Ohio." Martha smiled, a slow, thin-lipped expression that held no warmth. "The scythe doesn't wait for the weather, Detective. It moves when the grain is ready. You found the DNA. You broke the silence. Now, Silas has to close the book." Rossi lunged for the phone on the desk, but the line was dead. The wires had been cut with the same precision Caleb had used on the Emily Vance screen. He reached for his radio, but the deep ridges of the hollow blocked every signal. He was trapped in a house of ghosts while the real monster was 400 miles away, driving toward a suburban street that thought it was finally safe. He began to sprint back toward the front door, but as he reached the hallway, the rhythmic hyperventilation he had heard in the woods returned. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from behind the shelves. The walls of the library began to move. The bookcases were on hidden tracks, sliding inward to block his path. The meticulous organization of the house included a series of tactical traps designed to ensnare anyone who dared to browse the library of lost lives. Rossi fired his weapon into the mechanism of the nearest shelf, the sparks illuminating a hidden compartment behind the binders. Inside the compartment was a row of glass jars. And inside the jars, preserved in clear fluid, were the dark secrets the Thorns had kept for half a century. Not just jewelry or hair, but the physical remnants of the identities they had stolen: driver's licenses, social security cards, and dental molds. It was a factory of false identities. Rossi saw the original Arthur Vance's ID. He saw the David Barrett papers. And then his breath hitched. He saw a jar labeled Detective Leo Rossi, Akron PD, expected 2026. The psychological breakdown hadn't been Caleb's. It was a trap designed to draw Rossi here, to this house, to this room. The Thorns hadn't just been watching their victims, they had been scouting their replacements. The Ohio 2010 cold case wasn't a mistake Caleb had made. It was a lure the family had used to find a new lead character for their next chapter. They didn't want to kill Rossi. They wanted to become him. "You have such a clean life, Leo," Martha whispered, her voice now directly behind his ear. He spun around, but she was gone, her voice seemingly projected through the ventilation shafts. "No wife. No children. A dedicated public servant with a flawless record. You're the perfect mask. Silas will look so good in your skin." The deadlock was no longer a metaphor. Rossi was trapped in a shifting labyrinth of binders and bone dust, his flashlight battery flickering as the house itself seemed to breathe in his panic. He began to kick at the base of the shelves, desperate to find a weak point in the Victorian timber. He reached into his pocket for his backup flare, his fingers trembling. As the flare ignited, filling the library of lost lives with a violent, crimson glare, Rossi saw the truth of the bone pickers. The floorboards beneath the desk weren't wood. They were polished, inlaid bone, the remains of the discarded women from Oregon, Colorado, and beyond. They hadn't just buried their victims, they had built their home out of them. The haunting memories weren't just in the binders, they were under his feet. With a roar of pure, primal rage, Rossi threw the flare into the center of the library. The old parchment and dry wood ignited instantly. The library of lost lives began to scream as the fire took hold, the decades of stolen history curling into black ash. The chemical smell of the formaldehyde turned into a toxic, suffocating cloud. "Burn it all!" Rossi screamed, firing his remaining rounds into the ceiling. "Burn the whole goddamn legacy." He found a window in the back parlor, smashing through the glass and tumbling out into the wet Kentucky mud just as the first floor of the Thorn house was consumed by the fire. He didn't look back. He ran for his car, the hounds howling in the distance, a mournful, frustrated sound that echoed through the hollow. As he tore out of the driveway, the Thorn homestead was a pillar of fire against the black Appalachian sky. The dark secret was finally being cauterized, but the cost was absolute. Rossi knew he had minutes, not hours. Silas was on the road. the legacy of the scythe, was moving toward its final harvest. He drove with a manic, focused intensity, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon. He had to reach Akron. He had to reach the Miller family. He had to reach the Oak Grove before the man in the blue shirt arrived. The Ohio 2010 cold case was no longer about a girl who had died 14 years ago. It was about the girl who was still alive in his memory and the man who was coming to kill the memory itself. The emotional climax was no longer a courtroom verdict. It was a race against a phantom on a dark interstate. Rossi pushed the needle to 90, then 100, the wind screaming past his ears like the ghosts of the library he had just burned. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was the last line of defense against a family that had turned disappearance into an art form. As he crossed the Ohio border, the first flakes of an early winter snow began to fall, settling on the windshield like the dust of the thorn binders. The cold case was returning to the cold. The cycle was completing. And in the darkness of the highway, Rossi saw a pair of headlights in his rearview mirror, steady, unblinking, and gaining ground. Silas Thorne wasn't in Akron. Silas Thorne was right behind him. The strange clue of the photograph hadn't been a map of where Silas was going. It was a map of where he had been. He had followed Rossi to Kentucky. He had watched him enter the house. And now he was following him home. The mysterious disappearance was about to claim its final victim. Rossi gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his heart a frantic, dying bird in his chest. The lingering impact of the Thorne legacy was about to be written in his own blood. The road ahead was black, the snow was thickening, and the library of lost lives was burning in his mind. The final chapter had begun, and the scythe was already mid-swing. The Ohio Turnpike was a desolate, salt-stained ribbon of asphalt cutting through a landscape of skeletal trees and frozen fields. The snow, which had begun as a delicate dusting, had mutated into a blinding, horizontal assault, turning the world into a featureless, white void. Leo Rossi pushed his engine to the brink of failure, the tachometer needle dancing in the red, but no matter how fast he flew, the two pinpricks of light in his rearview mirror remained constant. They didn't flicker. They didn't waver. They hung there like the eyes of a persistent predator, closing the distance with a terrifying, mechanical inevitability. Silas Thorne wasn't just chasing him. He was hurting him. The meticulous organization of the Thorne family had accounted for this moment. As Rossi reached the desolate stretch between Mansfield and Akron, he realized his radio was still dead, his cell phone showing no service, in the heart of a dead zone Silas had undoubtedly scouted years ago. This was the deadlock in its purest form: two men, a high-speed engine, and a century of blood-soaked secrets colliding at 80 miles per hour on a sheet of black ice. Rossi gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. He could feel the weight of the library of lost lives behind him, the ghosts of Sarah, Rebecca, and Emily riding in the back seat, screaming for a resolution that didn't involve more graves. Suddenly, the headlights behind him surged. The dark silhouette of a heavy-duty pickup truck, the same make and model Arthur Vance had driven for 14 years, loomed in the rearview. It didn't slow down. It slammed into Rossi's bumper with a bone-jarring community shock of metal on metal. The sedan fishtailed, the tires screaming for purchase on the sleet. Rossi fought the wheel, his muscles burning, as the truck pulled alongside him. Through the snow-caked window of the pickup, he saw him. Silas Thorne was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was a man who looked like every father on every suburban street in America. He wore the blue work shirt, his face a mask of calm, professional focus. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man performing a necessary chore, a gardener pulling a stubborn weed. He turned the wheel sharply, the heavy steel guard of his truck grinding into the side of Rossi's door, sparking a violent, orange fire in the white darkness. "The harvest is ready, Leo," the wind seemed to scream, though Silas's lips didn't move. This strange clue of the Thorne succession plan finally clicked into place as the cars locked together, a jagged metal embrace at 90 miles per hour. Silas wasn't trying to kill him to escape. He was trying to kill him to become him. The jars in the library, the Detective Rossi dental molds. It wasn't just a fantasy. Silas had lived as Arthur Vance for a decade, and before that, as a dozen other men. He was a professional parasite, and Rossi was the host he had chosen for the next 30 years of his life. If Rossi died in a tragic accident on this turnpike, a man with his face, his prints, and his history would walk out of the hospital weeks later. The Thorne legacy didn't die with fire. It lived through the theft of the soul. With a desperate, primal roar, Rossi slammed on his brakes. The sudden change in momentum tore the cars apart. The pickup truck surged ahead, sliding sideways across the ice. Rossi saw his opening. He didn't swerve to avoid. He accelerated. He rammed the side of the truck's bed, sending the heavy vehicle into a violent, spinning roll. The truck flipped, once, twice, 3 times, shattering into a million pieces of glass and chrome before coming to a rest upside down in the frozen median. Silence returned to the turnpike, broken only by the ticking of Rossi's dying engine and the hiss of the falling snow. Rossi stepped out of his car, his legs trembling, his service weapon drawn and trembling in his frozen grip. He approached the wreckage of the truck, the haunting memories of the crawlspace and the library flashing before his eyes. The cabin was crushed, a mangled cage of steel. Inside, pinned beneath the steering column, was the man in the blue shirt. Blood matted his hair, and his breath came in the same rhythmic hyperventilation that had started this entire journey in 2010. "It's over, Silas," Rossi whispered, his voice disappearing into the gale. "The library is ash. The secret is out." The man in the wreck looked up. His eyes were not the blue of the Thorns. They were brown, dark, terrified, and familiar. "Detective, help me," the man wheezed. Rossi froze. He leaned closer, the flashlight beam illuminating the face. It wasn't Silas Thorne. It was Officer Mark Holloway, the first responder from the night Emily vanished. The man who had stood on the porch. The man who had bagged the shovel. The man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Akron for 14 years. The emotional climax was a sickening realization that turned Rossi's stomach to ice. Silas Thorne hadn't followed him from Kentucky. Silas Thorne had never left Ohio. He hadn't been the brother. He had been the shadow. Holloway, or the man who had stolen Holloway's life before the 2010 call ever came in, was the true architect. Caleb had been the decoy, the weak one, who took the fall, while the real librarian stayed inside the police department, guarding the files, watching the evidence, and waiting for the moment to harvest the investigator who got too close.
You
burned the records," Holloway gasped, a dark, oily smile spreading across his bloody lips. "But the library is in the blood. You can't burn what you've already become." As Holloway's eyes glazed over, the final breath of the Thorne legacy escaping his lungs, Rossi looked at his own hands. They were covered in the same grease and soot as the binders. He looked at the wreckage, at the cold case that had consumed his life, and he realized the terrifying truth of the Thorne succession. By obsessing over them, by hunting them, by learning their ways, he had transformed into the very thing he sought to destroy. The lingering shock was the sound of a second car pulling up on the shoulder of the road. A black SUV. The doors opened, and 2 men in tactical gear stepped out. They didn't call for an ambulance. They didn't check for a pulse. They walked straight to Rossi. "Detective Rossi," one of them said, his voice cold and clinical. "We've been waiting for you to finish the job. The archive in Kentucky was becoming a liability. Thank you for cleaning the slate." They weren't police. They weren't FBI. They were the bone pickers of the modern age, the men who managed the identities, the men who cleared the path for the Thorns of the world. The Ohio 2010 cold case wasn't a failure of justice. It was a masterpiece of corporate-level erasure. Rossi looked at the gun in his hand, then at the men approaching him. The snow was covering the wreckage, burying the body of Holloway, and whitening the road back to Akron. The mysterious disappearance was no longer Emily's. It was his. The cycle was completing. The harvest was over. And as the men reached for him, Rossi realized that the dark secret was that there was no end, only a change of shift. The snow did not just fall, it entombed the world in a heavy, suffocating shroud of white, turning the Ohio Turnpike into a ghost road where time and identity dissolved. Leo Rossi stood between the mangled wreckage of the past and the cold, tactical reality of the present, his breath hitching in the frozen air. The two men in the black SUV did not move with the urgency of law enforcement. They moved with the rhythmic, practiced grace of harvesters. They didn't see a detective, they saw a vacancy. They saw a man who had burned down the old library only to find that he had been drafted into writing the next volume. The Ohio 2010 cold case was not a tragedy to be solved, it was a transition to be managed. "You think you're taking me?" Rossi's voice was a jagged rasp, his hand tightening on the grip of his service weapon. "You think I'm just going to step into the jar?" The lead man, whose face was a blank canvas of corporate anonymity, tilted his head. "You already have, Leo. Look at the timeline. Look at the meticulous organization of your own life over the last year. You stopped seeing your friends. You stopped answering your sister's calls. You moved into a basement apartment and surrounded yourself with the names of the dead. You've been shedding Rossi for months. We just provided the destination." The emotional climax hit Rossi with the force of a physical blow. The Thorne legacy wasn't just a series of murders, it was a predatory evolution. They didn't just kill, they groomed. By luring him into the library of lost lives, by forcing him to witness the bone-inlaid floors and the jars of stolen souls, they had completed his initiation. The dark secret was that the hunter and the prey were the same creature, separated only by the direction of the scythe. He looked at the body of the man who had played Officer Holloway, the man who had guarded the lie for 14 years, and he realized that Holloway had once been just like him, a detective who got too close, a man who thought he was winning until he realized he was just being promoted. What about Emily? Rossi screamed into the gale, the name a final, desperate anchor to his humanity. What was she for? The man stepped closer, the snow crunching under his boots with a sound like breaking teeth. Emily was the catalyst. She was the one who was never supposed to be found, the one who was supposed to keep the Akron police occupied while the Vance identity was perfected. But she was also a thorn. She knew the secret before she even had a name for it. She didn't die because she found a box, Leo. She died because she was starting to enjoy the harvest. The lingering shock of that revelation turned the world gray. Rossi saw the floral sheets and the pink pajamas in a new, horrific light. The mysterious disappearance wasn't a kidnapping, it was a family dispute. Caleb hadn't killed a victim, he had eliminated a rival. The community shock had been built on the image of an innocent girl, but in the heart of the Thorne family, innocence was a defect that had to be cauterized. "The Miller family," Rossi whispered, thinking of the white oak grove on Elm Street. "The man in the blue shirt. Silas is already there," the man replied, checking his watch with a chilling indifference. "But not to kill them, to join them. The Millers need a handyman. They need a quiet neighbor who can fix the fence and watch the kids. The cycle doesn't end, Leo. It just moves to a different house on a different street. And you're going to Philadelphia. There's a detective there who just retired. A man with no family. A man whose life is a perfect, empty vessel. You're going to be a hero there, just like you were here." The deadlock was absolute. Rossi looked at his gun, then at the two men, then at the vast, frozen expanse of the Ohio night. He could pull the trigger, he could go down in a hail of gunfire, and he would be just another unexplained death on the turnpike. Or he could step into the SUV and become the ghost he had been chasing. The haunting memories of the last 14 years flashed before him, the frozen footprints, the gray lime, the burning library. He realized that the only way to truly protect the world from the Thorne legacy was to be the one who controlled the scythe from the inside. He lowered his weapon. The snow intensified, swirling in a violent, white vortex that seemed to erase the wreckage of the truck and the body of Holloway from the face of the earth. Rossi walked toward the SUV, his movements stiff, his soul feeling as cold and unyielding as the permafrost beneath his feet. As he reached the door, He looked back one last time toward Akron. In his mind, he saw the oak grove. He saw the trees swaying in the wind, their roots digging deep into the soil where Emily Vance once lay. The haunting of Ohio was permanent now, a secret foundation built into the very suburbia it pretended to serve. "Welcome to the harvest, detective," the man said as the door clicked shut, sealing out the sound of the storm. The Ohio 2010 cold case had ended. The genealogical testing had lulled the secret out, but the secret was too big for a courtroom, too dark for a prison, and too ancient for the light. The final revelation was that the truth doesn't set you free, it just gives you a new name. As the black SUV pulled away, disappearing into the whiteout of the turnpike, the only thing left behind was a single, leather glove lying in the snow, a textured, brown smudge against the pristine white. In Akron, the Miller family slept soundly, protected by the quiet neighbor who was even now checking the locks on their doors. In the Kentucky Hollow, the embers of the library grew cold under the winter rain. And in a precinct in Philadelphia, a desk was being cleared for a new arrival, a man with a flawless record and a tragic past, a man who knew exactly how to find the people who don't want to be found. The wind screamed across the state, a low, hollow wail that rattled the aluminum siding of the houses on Elm Street, a sound that the neighbors no longer recognized as a warning. It was just the weather. It was just the season. It was just the cold. The harvest was over, the granary was full, and the scythe was being sharpened for the spring. The story of Emily Vance was finished, but the story of the Thorne legacy was being written in every shadow, every silent house, and every stolen smile across the heart of America. The silence returned. The snow covered the tracks. The mystery was gone. The black SUV glided through the pre-dawn gray of Philadelphia, its tires whispering against the slush-covered cobblestones of Society Hill. Inside, Leo Rossi, or the man who had been Leo Rossi, stared at his reflection in the tinted glass. The transition had been surgical. In the 3 days since the turnpike, his life had been dismantled with the same clinical efficiency the Thorns used to strip a carcass. His bank accounts were closed. His apartment in Akron was professionally scrubbed. Even the photograph of Emily Vance had been reduced to a fine gray ash in a roadside incinerator. He was now Detective Elias Thornvaughn, a transfer from the Pacific Northwest with a commendable record and a deep, fabricated history of loss. He wasn't just wearing a mask, he had been grafted into a new reality. The final revelation of the Thorne succession was not a sudden burst of violence, but the slow, agonizing realization of total enclosure. As Elias stepped out of the vehicle and into the shadow of the 9th District Precinct, he felt the weight of the Library of Lost Lives settling into his own bones. He wasn't here to solve crimes. He was here to be the gatekeeper. He was the quiet clue that would never be found, the mysterious disappearance that had been successfully integrated into the system. Every officer who nodded to him in the hallway, every clerk who handed him a file, was a potential thread in a web he was now sworn to protect. The community shock of his arrival was non-existent. He was a ghost walking into a haunted house, perfectly at home in the gloom. "Nice to have you with us, Elias," a veteran sergeant grunted, barely looking up from his coffee. "Heard you had a rough run out west. We keep it quiet here. We like it that way." "Quiet is good," Elias replied, his voice a perfect imitation of the man Silas Thorne had told him he must become. "Quiet is where the work gets done." Back in Ohio, the lingering impact of the 2010 case had finally settled into the sediment of local legend. The Ohio 2010 cold case was officially marked as resolved, perpetrator deceased. The media had moved on to the next sensational headline, the next strange clue, in a different city. The oak grove on Elm Street continued to grow, its roots twisting around the memory of Emily Vance, drawing strength from the secret that lay beneath. The Miller family, now fully integrated with their handyman Silas, felt a strange, inexplicable sense of security. They didn't know that their peace was a byproduct of the harvest. They didn't know that the man who fixed their porch was the one who had built their tomb. The haunting memories for Elias, however, did not fade. In the quiet hours of his shift, He would sit at his new desk and look at the empty jars on the shelves of the evidence room. He saw the potential in them. He saw how easy it was to turn a person into a file into a memory, and a memory into nothing. He understood now why Caleb had gone soft. The desire to be seen, to be pitted, was a human weakness that the Thorne legacy had eventually purged. Silas was the pure form, and now Elias was his apprentice. The emotional climax of his life hadn't been the fire in Kentucky or the crash on the turnpike. It was the moment he realized he no longer missed his own name. The dark secret of the Thorne family was that they were the ultimate conservationists. They didn't waste lives, they recycled them. They took the discarded, the lonely, and the forgotten, and they gave them a second, darker purpose. As Elias opened his first missing persons file in Philadelphia, a runaway teenager from a broken home, he didn't feel the old surge of investigative heat. He felt the cold, methodical hunger of the scythe. He looked at the girl's photo, a shy smile and blue eyes that reminded him of a ghost from a previous life, and he reached for a clean, black binder. The Library of Lost Lives was not gone. It had simply moved into the digital clouds, into the police databases, into the very marrow of the justice system. The fire in Kentucky had only cleared the shelves for new inventory. And as the first flakes of a fresh Pennsylvania snow began to settle on the precinct windows, Elias Thornvaughn began to write. He wasn't writing a report, he was writing a preface. The Ohio 2010 cold case was the end of the beginning, but the harvest in Philadelphia was just starting. The cycle was complete. The hunter had become the curator. The silence was absolute. And somewhere, in the dark hollows of the Appalachian foothills, Martha Thorne sat in the ruins of her house, listening to the wind. She wasn't mourning. She was waiting, because she knew that no matter how deep you bury the truth, and no matter how many names you steal, the frost always returns. And when the frost comes, the Thornes are always there to meet it, shovel in hand, eyes wide in the dark, watching the world sleep, waiting for the next mysterious disappearance to begin.